Hi there, I'm Renos Vakis, lead economist at the World Bank, and your host for Accelerating Development Ideas for Impact. This is not your typical podcast. It's an AI powered conversation brought to you by the World Bank Institute for Economic Development, where we unpack the latest research with one goal in mind turning big ideas into real world impact. Let's get started.
Thank you for the introduction, Renos. The more we dig into this report on global economic prospects for January 2026, the more it says about how people think and act. It feels like we are looking at a global economy that, on the surface, seems bulletproof. I mean, we've seen trade tensions, policy uncertainty, and yet the numbers look surprisingly resilient.
It is a remarkable resilience, yes. If you look at the headline figures, global GDP growth is estimated at 2.7% for 2025, and it is projected to edge down just slightly to 2.6% in 2026.
Which, considering where we were a few years ago, sounds pretty good.
It is historic, actually. This recovery from the 2020 recession is the strongest we have seen in 6 decades. By 2025, global GDP per person is sitting 10% higher than it was on the eve of the pandemic. Inflation is moderating globally, interest rates are coming down. It sounds like a victory lap.
But I sense a but coming, because whenever I read these top line numbers, I wonder if everyone is actually feeling that recovery.
That is the catch. There is a sharp divergence hidden beneath those averages. While nearly all advanced economies have higher per capita income than they did pre pandemic, the story is very different elsewhere. 1 in 4 developing countries is essentially poorer than they were 5 years ago.
1 in 4? That's a massive gap.
It gets starker for low income countries. More than a third are poorer than in 2019. To put this in human terms, by the end of 2025, developing economies will average a GDP per person of roughly $6,500. In low income countries, that average is less than $700.
$700. That's about 1% of the level in advanced economies.
Precisely. So while the engine is running, it is leaving a significant portion of the train behind.
Okay, so we have this shock proof exterior with some serious fractures underneath. This brings us to the first big policy takeaway from the report. It talks about a downshift in growth.
Yes, we are moving into a slower gear. The average growth rate for the 2020s is set to be the lowest since the 1960s, and a big part of that is trade. Global trade growth is forecast to decelerate markedly in 2026 to 2.2%.
Why the sudden drop?
Because much of the activity we saw in 2025 was front loading. Businesses were rushing to move goods before anticipated tariff increases hit. Now that the rush is fading, we're seeing the real slower pace.
That makes sense. It's like buying everything you need before a price hike. Eventually, you stop buying. But here's the part that really surprised me in the outline. We're looking at a demographic pressure cooker that I don't think people are talking about enough.
This is the defining challenge for emerging markets. By 2035, 1.2 billion young people will reach working age in emerging market and developing economies.
1.2 billion. That's a lot of resumes.
It is a lot of interviews to schedule, certainly. But seriously, to employ this population, these economies need to focus on industries that are labor intensive and less susceptible to automation.
So, what's holding them back? Why aren't the jobs being created fast enough?
It comes down to an investment gap. For the past 15 years, investment growth has remained broadly stagnant. Most of these countries have failed to lift investment per worker toward the levels we see in advanced economies. Without mobilizing private capital, there simply won't be enough jobs.
So, if you're a policymaker reading this, what's the move? Where do you put your energy?
The report identifies 4 high potential sectors: infrastructure, agribusiness, healthcare, and tourism. These are the areas that create local jobs.
And I guess the picture looks different depending on where you are on the map.
Very much so. In the East Asia and Pacific region, growth is slowing to 4.4% in 2026, largely because China is undergoing a structural slowdown. Meanwhile, South Asia is remaining strong, though moderating to 6.2%. India specifically is forecast at 6.5% growth.
And what about sub-Saharan Africa, given the poverty stats we mentioned earlier?
Growth is firming to 4.3% in 2026, but, and this is critical, the per capita income gains remain insufficient to significantly reduce extreme poverty. The economy is growing, but not fast enough for the population.
Which brings us to the second deep dive, and honestly, the trickier part. If you need to invest in health and infrastructure to create jobs, you need money. But the report paints a pretty grim picture of government bank accounts right now.
It does. Government debt in emerging markets and developing economies has climbed to nearly 70% of GDP in 2024. That is the highest level in 55 years.
55 years? Wow.
And interest payments on that debt are eating up more revenue than they did prior to the pandemic. To make matters worse, foreign aid budgets from high income economies are shrinking. So, developing economies cannot wait for help, they must rely on domestic policy discipline.
This is where the report pivots to a solution called fiscal rules. Now, most people hear that and think accounting boringness, but the data here is fascinating. What exactly is a fiscal rule?
Think of it like a diet plan, but for a government budget. It's a numerical limit on things like deficits or debt. As of 2024, 55% of these emerging and developing economies have adopted at least one fiscal rule. That's up from roughly 15% in the year 2000.
So it's becoming the norm. But does it work, or is it just a rule on paper that gets ignored?
The evidence suggests it works. Adopting these rules is associated with tangible improvements. 5 years after adoption, the budget balance, specifically the cyclically adjusted primary balance, improves by a cumulative 1.4 percentage points of GDP.
So putting the rule in place actually forces the saving.
It changes behavior. Here's the statistic that really stands out. The probability of starting a fiscal adjustment episode, basically a period where you really clean up the budget, jumps from 5% in countries without rules to 14% in countries with them.
That's almost triple the odds. That's significant.
However, design matters. You can't just pass a law and hope for the best. The report finds that rules are more effective when adopted during strong economic conditions. If you try to implement strict rules when your economy is already weak, they often fail to produce results.
Right. It's easier to start a diet when you're not starving.
Exactly, and the type of rule matters. A deficit rule, limiting how much you overspend each year, is central to lasting improvement. Also, there is a trade off between simplicity and enforcement. Simple rules tend to lead to revenue based adjustments, like raising taxes. Rules with strict enforcement provisions tend to lead to expenditure based adjustments, like cutting spending.
That connects the dots for me. So the way you write the rule determines whether you end up taxing more or spending less.
And crucially, institutions matter. In countries with strong institutions, the positive effect of these rules peaks at a 2.5 percentage point improvement. In countries with weak institutions, the gains just aren't sustained. You need the machinery of government to back up the rule.
So we have a slowing global economy, a massive need for jobs for young people, and a debt crisis that requires strict rules to fix. It feels like a tightrope walk. What are the risks that could knock us off?
There are three main downside risks. First, trade. A renewed escalation of tensions could dampen growth further. Second, financial conditions. A sharp decline in equity valuations alongside plunging confidence could reduce global growth by up to 0.3 percentage points in 2026.
And the third?
Commodities. Oil prices are projected to fall to $60 per barrel in 2026 due to oversupply. That is good for importers, but it will strain oil exporting developing economies significantly.
Okay, so as we wrap up, it sounds like the resilience of 2025 was a bit of a mirage, or at least temporary?
The report argues that the resilience was partly due to temporary factors. like that trade front loading and fiscal spending that we cannot easily repeat.
So, what is the final word for policymaker?
It is time to return to fiscal orthodoxy. That sounds rigid, but it is necessary. It involves adopting those well designed fiscal rules to rebuild buffers and simultaneously enacting structural reforms to attract the private investment needed to employ those 1.2 billion young people.
It's about building a foundation that isn't just shockproof for today, but ready for the next generation.
Exactly. We must step back and see that while the headline growth is comforting, the real work is in closing that divergence between the rich and the poor. It is about turning that temporary resilience into durable, long term stability. The tools are there, fiscal rules, targeted investment, but the will to use them is what matters now. Over to you, Renos.
Thank you for joining us. You can find the full report on our website. Just follow the link in the description. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know about upcoming episodes. And before you go, how do you plan to put what you learn into practice? And what topics you'd like us to explore next? We'd love to know. Until then, goodbye.